Abu Omar al Baghdadi, the first architect of the Islamic State. Part 1. Origins and Early Life of Hamid Dawud Mohamed Khalil al-Zawi. Hamid Dawud Mohamed Khalil al-Zawi, later known to the world as Abu Omar al Baghdadi, was born in 1964 in the rural village of al-Zawiya, nestled in the sun-scorched expanse of Iraq's al-Anbar governorate. This region, located in western Iraq near the Euphrates River, and not far from the town of Haditha, was known for its conservative tribal structure and deep-rooted Sunni Islamic traditions. For centuries, al-Anbar's tribes had been shaped by isolation, tradition, and a fierce sense of autonomy that bred both loyalty and suspicion toward outsiders. The Zawi family into which Hamid was born traced its lineage to the al-Arajiya, a branch of the Quraysh tribe, the same ancient Arab tribe from which the Prophet Muhammad himself had descended. In traditional Arab society, such a lineage carried not only social prestige but a subtle but powerful claim to religious and moral authority. The al-Arajiya, though not politically dominant in Iraq's Ba'athist hierarchy, were revered in the local region for their piety and proud heritage. Hamid's father, Sheikh Muhammad Khalil al-Zawi, was a respected tribal elder whose word carried weight in the surrounding communities. As a son of a tribal sheikh, Hamid was raised in an environment of discipline, honor, and devout adherence to religious customs. From an early age, Hamid displayed signs of intelligence, seriousness, and a tendency toward introspection. While many of his peers in al-Zawiya focused on agricultural work or tribal affairs, Hamid developed a strong interest in religious texts and public service. The combination of tribal responsibility and religious consciousness shaped his formative years. His early education was conducted in local schools under the oversight of teachers loyal to the Ba'athist regime. These were years when the Saddam Hussein government exerted increasing control over Iraq's institutions, including its educational system, seeking to root out religious radicalism and maintain absolute ideological authority. Despite this, Hamid distinguished himself academically, showing a particular aptitude for memorization, logic, and legal reasoning. Recognizing his potential, his family encouraged him to pursue higher education. He was eventually admitted to the police academy in Baghdad, a significant achievement for a young man from a tribal village. The academy was a strict and hierarchical institution, intended not only to train future officers in law enforcement techniques but to instill loyalty to the Ba'athist state. There, Hamid was drilled in tactics, law, discipline, and political doctrine. However, during his years at the academy, Hamid began to show signs of internal conflict. While he outwardly conformed to the regime's expectations, his inner beliefs were increasingly shaped by a growing exposure to Salafi thought. Salafism, a purist form of Islam that emphasized a literalist interpretation of the Quran and Hadith and demanded a return to the practices of the Prophet's companions, had been spreading quietly across parts of the Islamic world, including Iraq. Though officially discouraged by Saddam's secular administration, Salafism found fertile ground in conservative areas like al-Anbar, where tribal codes and religious identity remained deeply entwined. After completing his studies, Hamid returned to Haditha and began his career as a police officer. His role gave him authority and social standing, but his commitment to Salafist ideals made him increasingly uncomfortable with what he viewed as the moral decay and secularism of the regime. By 1993, the contradiction between his religious convictions and his official duties became too stark to ignore. Reports began to surface that he had been preaching Salafi doctrines and criticizing government policies, especially those that he believed conflicted with Islamic law. These activities did not go unnoticed by his superiors, who reported him to the Ministry of Interior. Eventually, he was summarily dismissed from the police force. This dismissal marked a major turning point in Hamid's life. No longer a servant of the Iraqi state, he now entered a period of personal transformation and ideological hardening. To support his family, he opened a small electronics repair shop in Haditha. The business was modest but provided a livelihood. Yet, Hamid's primary focus was no longer commercial, it was religious. He began leading prayers and preaching sermons as the Imam of the al-Asaf Mosque, which soon became a focal point for the dissemination of Salafi teachings in the region. His sermons emphasized strict moral conduct, rejection of innovation in religious practice, bid'ah, and the need to return to the pristine Islam of the early generations. Through his mosque activities, Hamid attracted a growing circle of followers, many of them young, disillusioned men looking for meaning in a society increasingly plagued by corruption, poverty, and repression. His charisma was quiet but persuasive, grounded in a sense of authenticity and moral purpose. He was no fiery orator, but his calm, deliberate style of preaching appealed to those who valued knowledge and conviction over theatrics. This period of quiet activism laid the groundwork for what was to come. Hamid al-Zawi was no longer merely a former police officer. He was emerging as a religious ideologue, a mentor, and eventually a leader of resistance. While he still lived a relatively ordinary life on the surface, beneath it was a growing network of sympathizers, a deepening ideology, and a simmering anger at both the secular regime of Saddam Hussein and the growing foreign influences on Iraqi soil. Unknown to the wider world at the time, the man who once repaired radios and led prayer in a small Iraqi town would one day become the head of one of the most feared insurgent groups in the post-Saddam Middle East. The seeds of jihad, nurtured by ideology, repression, and personal experience, had already begun to sprout. Part 2. The Fall of Saddam and the Rise of Armed Insurgency. The year 2003 marked a watershed moment in both Iraqi and global history. The United States, leading a coalition of international forces, launched a full-scale invasion of Iraq with the stated goals of toppling Saddam Hussein's regime and eliminating alleged weapons of mass destruction. The invasion and the swift dismantling of the Ba'athist state plunged Iraq into chaos. Institutions collapsed, sectarian divisions deepened, and a vacuum emerged that would soon be filled by a violent insurgency fueled by anger, humiliation, and ideology. It was in this crucible of post-invasion turmoil that Hamid al-Zawi would be reborn as Abu Omar al Baghdadi. The fall of the regime that had once dismissed him provided both an opportunity and a calling. Having spent the last decade as a Salafi preacher and community leader, Hamid saw the American-led occupation not only as a foreign incursion into Iraqi sovereignty, but as a religious affront. To him and many like-minded men, it was a divine test, and resistance was not only justified but required. The occupation galvanized a generation of Iraqi Islamists who had long been marginalized by Saddam's secularism but now saw themselves as defenders of both faith and homeland. In May 2004, just over a year after the U.S. invasion, Hamid al-Zawi formally stepped into the insurgency. Drawing upon his tribal connections, his religious authority, and his local knowledge of Western Iraq, he founded a small but resolute militant group, Jaish al-Taifa al-Mansura, or the Army of the Victorious Sect. The name itself was rooted in Islamic tradition, evoking a hadith that promised victory to a Taifa Mansura, a steadfast group that would remain on the truth in the face of adversity. This early group was composed primarily of former Ba'athist soldiers, Salafi loyalists, and disaffected tribal youth from the Haditha region. Although initially small and under-resourced, Jaish al-Taifa al-Mansura quickly demonstrated a capacity for action. Its fighters carried out ambushes, sniper attacks, and sabotage operations against coalition convoys and Iraqi collaborators. The group's most infamous early attack came on August 31, 2005, when it launched a mortar and rocket strike on the Al-Aima Bridge in Baghdad, a strategically vital crossing over the Tigris River. Though details remain murky, the attack resulted in the deaths of 7 people and left 35 wounded. It shocked the public and signaled that resistance forces could strike infrastructure in the heart of the capital. While many insurgent groups operated in isolation or competed for influence, Abu Omar's group was more focused on building ideological cohesion. He remained committed to a Salafi jihadist worldview that framed the conflict in stark terms: Islam versus unbelief, Muslims versus crusaders, and divine justice versus Western tyranny. His fighters were not mere nationalists, they were warriors in a global struggle. Yet Abu Omar's local roots gave him an advantage. Unlike many foreign jihadists, he understood Iraq's tribal codes, cultural nuances, and local grievances. He could speak not only the language of religion, but of revenge, dignity, and honor things deeply embedded in Iraqi identity. Abu Omar's growing reputation among insurgents drew the attention of coalition forces. Sometime in late 2004 or early 2005, his home was raided by U.S. troops acting on intelligence that he was sheltering foreign Arab fighters. He was arrested and transferred to the U.S. military's Al-Assad Air Base, a sprawling complex in the heart of Al-Anbar province. There, soldiers seized and analyzed his computer and interrogated him. However, lacking sufficient evidence or failing to identify his true role in the insurgency, U.S. authorities eventually released him. For Abu Omar, this brief detention was a pivotal moment. It was both a brush with death and a signal of his own importance. Upon release, he emerged more determined and ideologically hardened. He also understood that his mission needed to expand beyond his isolated cell. It was during this time that he began interacting with prominent figures in the broader jihadist movement, including individuals within Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, the organization founded by the infamous Jordanian militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Through meetings with Zarqawi himself, as well as senior figures like Abu Muhammad al-Lubnani and Abu Anas al-Shami, Abu Omar gained access to a broader jihadist network. These men were not merely fighters, they were ideologues, strategists, and architects of a transnational Islamic movement. At this point, Abu Omar adopted the kunya, Abu Mahmud, masking his identity and signaling his deeper integration into the global jihadist project. His path had evolved from local rebellion to ideological warfare. Abu Omar's understanding of warfare was shaped not only by his police training and tribal instincts but by his deepening religious doctrine. He began drafting internal memos and strategy papers, many of which focused on how to blend Sharia governance with guerrilla warfare. He emphasized the importance of spreading Tawhid, monotheism, establishing Sharia courts, and eliminating tribal customs he viewed as un-Islamic. His goal was not simply to defeat the Americans militarily, it was to restructure society itself according to Salafi doctrine. He remained, however, under constant threat. His growing notoriety and leadership within jihadist circles placed a target on his back. One particularly well-known story from this period illustrates both the danger he faced and the tribal complexities of navigating Iraq during the insurgency. While traveling from Haditha to Baghdad with his family, Abu Omar's convoy was preceded by a scout vehicle that was to check for American checkpoints. When the vehicle disappeared and Abu Omar approached a checkpoint near the city of Hit, he was stopped for inspection. A U.S. allied Iraqi soldier asked for his ID. Abu Omar, calculating the risk, presented his tribal identification card from the Al-Arajia clan. The soldier, unfamiliar with tribal names, assumed the name indicated a Shiite identity and grew nervous. "Sayyid, how could you come to such a dangerous area?" the soldier asked him, explaining that terrorists roamed the countryside and had reportedly just left Haditha. Abu Omar, calm and reserved, assured the soldier that he and his family were not a threat. The soldier, duped by the tribal title and misled by Abu Omar's soft-spoken demeanor, allowed the car to pass through without searching it. In the shadows of a battlefield, survival often depended on deception and knowledge of local identity markers. Abu Omar's blend of religious extremism, military discipline, and tribal cunning made him increasingly vital to the insurgency. As his influence grew, so too did his ambition. The seeds were now planted for his eventual rise to leadership of the Mujahideen Shura Council and later the Islamic State of Iraq. But first, he would have to navigate the ever-deepening rivalries, betrayals, and bloodshed of the jihadist underworld. Part 3. Climbing the Ranks. From strategist to emir of jihad. By 2005, Iraq had become the epicenter of the global jihadist movement. The collapse of Saddam Hussein's government, the disbanding of the Iraqi army, and the brutality of the American occupation had created fertile ground for extremist ideologies to take root and flourish. Foreign fighters poured into Iraq through porous borders, while sectarian tensions between Sunni and Shia Iraqis spiraled into deadly confrontations. Amid this chaos, Abu Omar al Baghdadi, formerly Hamid al-Zawi, rose steadily from the shadows to take on a prominent role in shaping the direction of the insurgency. After his release from Al-Assad Air Base and his deeper involvement with Jamaat al-Tawhid wal-Jihad, Abu Omar became increasingly integrated into the leadership circles of jihadist factions. He initially operated under the kunya Abu Mahmud, remaining relatively anonymous as he coordinated operations, trained new recruits, and laid out ideological guidelines for his subordinates. It was during this time that he began to distinguish himself not only as a tactician but as a thinker, someone who could blend Islamic theology with insurgent strategy. Around this time, the late Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was dominating global headlines as the face of jihad in Iraq. Zarqawi, a charismatic and ruthless Jordanian militant, had sworn allegiance to Osama bin Laden and rebranded his group as al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. He was known for his brutal method sectarian bombings, beheadings, and symbolic attacks intended to ignite Sunni-Shia civil war. Zarqawi's actions drew international condemnation but also deepened the radicalization of Iraq's Sunni population, many of whom felt abandoned, disenfranchised, and targeted by the Shia-dominated post-Saddam government. Abu Omar, though sharing Zarqawi's overarching ideological vision, took a more calculated approach. While Zarqawi was confrontational and theatrical, Abu Omar sought structure, organization, and permanence. He understood the importance of local legitimacy of presenting the insurgency not merely as a group of terrorists, but as a budding Islamic government that could offer order in place of chaos. To this end, he devoted increasing attention to the Mujahideen Shura Council, MSC, an umbrella group of Sunni jihadist factions founded in early 2006 to unify resistance efforts under a more cohesive structure. Abu Omar joined the MSC and quickly became one of its leading figures. Within the council, he served on the Sharia Council, where he helped shape the organization's legal and religious policies, including rulings on punishments, conduct in battle, and interaction with tribal communities. At the same time, he was also given command over security operations in Baghdad province, one of the most volatile regions in the country. These dual roles allowed him to balance ideological leadership with operational command, further enhancing his stature among his peers. Not long after, Abu Omar's strategic acumen earned him a new position, governor of Diyala province for the MSC. Diyala, located to the northeast of Baghdad, was a sectarian flashpoint and a strategic corridor for smuggling weapons and fighters. As governor, Abu Omar implemented a rigid form of Islamic law, cracked down on local tribal leaders who refused to comply, and established underground courts that issued fatwas and verdicts in accordance with Salafi interpretations of Sharia. The goal was to show that jihadists could do more than fight; they could govern, legislate, and enforce divine law. Following the death of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi in a U.S. airstrike on June 7, 2006, the leadership vacuum in Iraq's jihadist movement was palpable. While Zarqawi's successor, Abu Ayyub al-Masri, Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, took over the operational reins of AQI, it was clear that a new structure was needed, one that would project an Iraqi face and lend credibility to an increasingly foreign-dominated movement. Abu Omar al Baghdadi, whose tribal credentials, local roots, and ideological rigor made him an ideal figurehead, emerged as the solution. In October 2006, a major announcement was made. The Mujahideen Shura Council would be dissolved, and in its place, a new entity would rise: the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI. Abu Omar al Baghdadi was declared its emir, leader, and Abu Ayyub al-Masri was named Minister of War. The declaration was both symbolic and strategic. By presenting the ISI as an Islamic state rather than just a terrorist organization, its leaders sought to claim religious legitimacy, territorial sovereignty, and the right to rule. The selection of Abu Omar as emir was a carefully calculated move. His background in Iraqi tribal society, combined with his unwavering commitment to Salafi jihadist ideology, made him uniquely capable of bridging the divide between foreign fighters and local populations. He was the Iraqi face of a movement that desperately needed local authenticity. Under his leadership, the ISI called on all Sunni insurgent groups in Iraq to pledge allegiance to the new emirate. Some complied, others resisted. Abu Omar's speeches, which were distributed as audio recordings on jihadist forums, were marked by a tone of religious fervor and uncompromising militancy. He denounced democracy as kufr, unbelief, condemned the Shia as apostates, and declared war on anyone who collaborated with the Americans or the Iraqi government. He styled himself not just as a military leader, but as a commander of the faithful, Amir al-Mu'minina, title historically reserved for caliphs and Islamic rulers. It was a bold declaration of intent. The ISI was not merely a faction it aspired to be the nucleus of a new caliphate. However, the declaration of the Islamic State of Iraq was also fraught with controversy. Many Sunnis who had supported the resistance now found themselves at odds with the ISI's rigid religious policies and violent enforcement. Tribal leaders who once welcomed Abu Omar's fighters turned against them when their authority was undermined or their traditions labeled un-Islamic. The ISI's harsh governance, including executions, floggings, and forced marriages, alienated portions of the very Sunni population it sought to represent. Despite this growing backlash, Abu Omar remained steadfast. In his mind, compromise was a sign of weakness and deviation from divine law. He believed that hardship and rejection were necessary trials in the pursuit of establishing God's rule on earth. Like many Salafi jihadist ideologues before him, he drew upon Islamic history, particularly the struggles of the Prophet Muhammad and the early caliphs to justify violence, assert authority, and endure opposition. Abu Omar's ascent to the leadership of the ISI marked the beginning of a new phase in Iraq's insurgency. What began as a scattered resistance against foreign occupation was now evolving into an ideological project of state-building. However brutal and bloody that project would prove to be, at its center stood a former police officer turned imam turned warlord, Abu Omar al Baghdadi, the man who sought to cloak jihad in the mantle of governance. Part 4. The Shadow Emir. Controversies, Deception, and the Question of Identity. As the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI expanded its operations across Iraq in 2006 and 2007, its self-declared emir, Abu Omar al Baghdadi, emerged as both a feared symbol and an enigmatic figure. His voice filled jihadist forums and audio recordings, but his face remained hidden, and few, even among jihadist ranks, had seen him in person. His mystique added to the movement's aura of invincibility. Yet, it also became a source of intense controversy and international speculation. In July 2007, a major development shook the credibility of the ISI leadership. Brigadier General Kevin Bergner, a spokesman for the U.S. military in Iraq, publicly claimed in a press briefing that Abu Omar al-Baghdadi did not actually exist. According to U.S. intelligence gathered through the interrogation of a captured jihadist named Khalid al-Mashadani, who identified himself as an intermediary between al-Qaeda's core leadership, AQI. The position of Abu Omar was a fabricated persona created to give an Iraqi face to what was in fact a foreign-dominated insurgency. Bergner alleged that the audio statements attributed to Abu Omar were recorded by an aging Iraqi actor hired by al-Qaeda in Iraq to impersonate him. This claim sent shockwaves through the counter-terrorism community. If true, it would mean that the very figurehead of the ISI, a man who had declared himself emir and called on all Sunnis to obey him, was nothing more than a fictional character. The narrative of local leadership, the notion of a homegrown caliphate so carefully crafted by the ISI would unravel entirely. These doubts were not limited to American officials. The spokesman of a rival Sunni insurgent group, Hamas of Iraq, also claimed in 2008 that al-Baghdadi was a fabrication. He echoed the U.S. military suspicions, asserting that the persona of Abu Omar was an invention designed to obscure foreign control over the movement and to win the trust of tribal Iraqis. Given the sharp divisions among jihadist factions and their competing narratives, such a statement had to be viewed with caution. Nonetheless, the controversy around Abu Omar's identity refused to fade. Despite these accusations, IC leadership maintained that Abu Omar was real, alive, and in command. In an effort to reinforce his credibility, they doubled down on releasing regular audio communiques, lengthy sermons filled with Quranic references, denunciations of Shiites, the Iraqi government, and the American-led coalition, as well as religious justifications for suicide bombings and armed rebellion. Abu Omar, whether real or symbolic, became a rallying point for radicalized Sunni youth disillusioned with both occupation forces and Iraq's new political elite. Over time, U.S. intelligence began to reconsider the initial assessment. As operations against ISI intensified and more field commanders were captured, new evidence suggested that Abu Omar al Baghdadi was not a fabrication after all, but rather a real individual who had assumed the role initially envisioned as a placeholder. While it was possible that the character had been invented early on, it appeared increasingly likely that a man, Hamid Dawud Mohamed Khalil al-Zawi, had eventually stepped into the persona, or had always occupied it, hiding behind layers of secrecy and deniability. This ambiguity was no accident. The practice of using noms de guerre, kunyas, and concealing identities was common in jihadist movements. It served not only to protect leaders from being easily targeted, but also to elevate them into mythic status. Abu Omar's invisibility gave him an ethereal presence. He could be everywhere and nowhere, a spiritual leader as much as a military commander. The idea of a hidden emir, part theologian, part warrior, lent a sense of divine mystery to the ISI's narrative. But while mystery served the purpose of propaganda, it also created operational risks. Inside the movement, there were instances of confusion, betrayal, and even accusations of misrepresentation. Some fighters questioned whether the leadership was really in control. Others speculated about infighting within the ISI's Shura Council. The aura around Abu Omar occasionally seemed to falter, especially as the Al-Anbar Awakening USC backed tribal uprising against jihadists. Excesses gained traction and began turning the tide in key Sunni areas. Yet even amid controversy, Abu Omar continued to shape the ideological trajectory of the Islamic State of Iraq. He insisted that the struggle was not just a military campaign but a religious obligation, an act of worship. He presented himself not as a temporary resistance figure, but as a permanent authority and Islamic ruler presiding over territory governed by divine law. In his speeches, he rejected the legitimacy of all secular governments and derided democracy as idolatry, positioning ISI as the only true Islamic entity in Iraq. The lack of verifiable images of Abu Omar became an element of psychological warfare. American, Iraqi, and even rival jihadist forces did not know precisely who they were dealing with. Every captured ISI member was scrutinized. Was this the elusive emir? Every rumor of his death sparked speculation, only to be dismissed by new tapes and messages. His absence from the battlefield became a presence in itself, a void filled with audio recordings, martyrdom declarations, and shrouded threats. It wasn't just a matter of operational security, it was myth-making. And in jihadist ideology, myths are as powerful as men. Meanwhile, Abu Omar's decision to demand allegiance from all other Sunni insurgent groups created deep rifts. He insisted that any legitimate resistance against the occupation had to come under the banner of the Islamic State of Iraq. This declaration alienated tribal fighters who had taken up arms to defend their homes but were reluctant to embrace ISI's ultra-radicalism. Tensions flared between nationalist Sunni insurgents and the ISI's theocratic vision. Those who refused to pledge bay'ah allegiance were declared apostates or traitors, and in many cases, assassinated. This purge mentality contributed to the ISI's growing isolation by 2008. The group's brutality, coupled with Abu Omar's rigid religious interpretations, pushed many Sunni leaders into cooperating with U.S. forces and the fledgling Iraqi government. The very people who had once cheered ISI's defiance now turned their weapons against it. Still, within the inner circles of jihadist ideologues, Abu Omar remained a revered figure, a symbol of uncompromising resistance and divine governance. Whether viewed as a living man or a constructed persona, he had by now become inseparable from the ISI brand. The man who once repaired radios in Haditha was now shaping a global conversation on jihad, statehood, and legitimacy. But for all his power, Abu Omar was no longer untouchable. As the United States and its Iraqi allies ramped up intelligence and counterinsurgency operations, the circle around him began to shrink. He had survived for years in the shadows, but the walls were closing in. A reckoning was approaching. Part 5. Survival, Warfare, and the Struggle for Control. As the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI entered 2008. Its power was beginning to erode. Abu Omar al Baghdadi, who just a few years earlier had been crowned the elusive emir of a newly declared Islamic State, now faced growing resistance on all fronts. The group had lost significant territory, key commanders had been captured or killed, and the once growing tide of support from Iraq's Sunni tribes was rapidly ebbing. Yet even amid adversity, Abu Omar continued to guide his organization with an iron will and a theological rigidity that refused compromise. One of the most critical factors contributing to ISI's diminishing strength was the emergence of the Sunni Awakening movement. In 2006 and 2007, Sunni tribal leaders in al-Anbar province, once among the strongest supporters of the insurgency, began to turn against ISI. This was not because of a newfound affinity for the United States or the Shia-led Iraqi government, but rather a reaction to ISI's brutality and ideological extremism. Under Abu Omar's leadership, the ISI had imposed a puritanical form of Sharia, executed tribal elders who refused to pledge allegiance, and treated Iraqis who didn't follow their rule as heretics. The Awakening movement began in earnest in the city of Ramadi, but soon spread to Fallujah, Hadatha, and other parts of western Iraq. Tribal fighters, many of whom had once fought U.S. troops, now allied with American forces and began driving ISI militants out of their strongholds. The tide of war was turning, and with it, the myth of the invincible caliphate began to unravel. U.S. commanders capitalized on this momentum, launching aggressive counterinsurgency operations aimed specifically at decapitating ISI's leadership network. Amid this crisis, Abu Omar worked harder than ever to maintain cohesion and morale within his ranks. He moved frequently between safe houses, often traveling at night to avoid detection. He no longer operated from the cities he had once claimed as his capital, Baghdad and Diyarbakir, from rural hideouts and tribal zones still loyal to his cause. He relied on a trusted inner circle for communication, and his messages were relayed through encrypted recordings uploaded to jihadist forums and distributed via couriers. In these recordings, Abu Omar continued to project strength and divine purpose. He denounced the awakening leaders as traitors and apostates, accusing them of selling out the jihad for money and power. He called upon his followers to remain patient, to endure hardship as a test from God, and to trust that victory would return. His rhetoric took on a more apocalyptic tone, portraying the conflict not merely as a struggle for Iraq, but as a battle between Islam and the forces of global unbelief. Yet his influence, though still formidable, was waning. U.S. and Iraqi intelligence agencies launched multiple manhunts for Abu Omar during this period. Tips from former insurgents and tribal allies provided actionable intelligence, and raids became more frequent. Several times, reports emerged that he had been captured or killed. On March 9, 2007, the Iraqi Interior Ministry claimed that Abu Omar had been arrested during a sweep in Baghdad. State-run television aired footage of a man they identified as the ISI leader. However, within days, doubts began to circulate. The evidence was weak, the suspect's identity unverifiable, and the ISI swiftly denied the claim. The man in custody was not Abu Omar. It was another false lead, but it demonstrated the level of pressure being exerted by Iraqi authorities to prove they were winning the war against insurgency. Less than 2 months later, on May 3, 2007, the same Interior Ministry announced that Abu Omar al Baghdadi had been killed in an operation north of Baghdad. Once again, this turned out to be premature or entirely false. No body was produced, and ISI operatives quickly released a statement denying his death. The recurring pattern of alleged kills and denials created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Was Abu Omar truly alive? Had he been replaced? Or was the figure already symbolic a role filled by more than one man? The fog of war surrounding Abu Omar's identity and survival served both as a weapon and a weakness. On one hand, it kept him elusive, untraceable, and mythologized. On the other, it allowed critics, both jihadist and non-jihadist, to question his legitimacy, to doubt his leadership, and to fracture ISI's ideological cohesion. Despite the confusion, Abu Omar remained active behind the scenes. He worked closely with his Minister of War, Abu Ayyub al-Mazri, an Egyptian-born militant with deep ties to al-Qaeda. Together, they maintained the structure of the ISI even as its geographic footprint shrank. They organized clandestine training camps, facilitated the smuggling of weapons from Syria and the Gulf, and recruited suicide bombers from across the Sunni world. The ISI was wounded, but it was not dead. One of the tools that kept ISI alive during these lean years was its media apparatus. Despite the physical setbacks, the group maintained a steady flow of online propaganda. Abu Omar's voice delivered through distorted audio, Quranic allusions, and invocations of divine wrath became the centerpiece of this media effort. He called on Muslims everywhere to join the jihad, especially in Iraq, and he painted the occupation and its allies as the vanguard of a global conspiracy against Islam. This media warfare allowed Abu Omar to extend his reach far beyond Iraq's borders. His speeches were translated, shared, and analyzed by intelligence agencies and jihadist sympathizers alike. For many foreign recruits, he became the voice of the Islamic State, a theological leader fighting not just against invaders, but to revive the golden age of the caliphate. In effect, he turned setbacks into proof of martyrdom and divine testing, a narrative that would become a cornerstone of ISI's later evolution. Still, life in hiding took its toll. Constant movement, betrayals within the insurgency, pressure from foreign intelligence networks, and the shifting loyalty of local populations meant that Abu Omar was leading an increasingly fragile state in exile. His fighters were still launching attack-scar bombings in Baghdad, assassinations of government officials, ambushes of coalition forces, but the dreams of full territorial control seemed distant. The Islamic State of Iraq had not collapsed, but it had retreated, and at its center, cloaked in secrecy, still moved the man once dismissed as a myth, Abu Omar al Baghdadi. But fate, as it had so many times before, would soon catch up with him. Part 6. Final Pursuits. Closing in on the Emir. By 2009, the war in Iraq had shifted dramatically. Coalition forces had begun their phased withdrawal, and the newly trained Iraqi security forces were increasingly taking the lead in counterinsurgency operations. Although the Islamic State of Iraq ISI remained dangerous, its capacity to hold territory and act openly had been sharply curtailed. Many of its fighters had gone underground, blending into rural areas or into the urban slums where security forces struggled to maintain control. Despite the odds, Abu Omar al Baghdadi continued to direct the movement in secrecy, clinging to the vision of an Islamic emirate that would one day rise again. But the walls were closing in. The U.S. military, working closely with the Iraqi government, had devoted substantial resources to tracking the ISI leadership. American drones, electronic surveillance, human intelligence, and signal intercepts were all deployed in the effort to dismantle what remained of the ISI's command network. Abu Omar was now one of the most wanted men in the country, and with him was his close companion and military commander, Abu Ayyub al-Masri, the Egyptian jihadist who had succeeded Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and become Minister of War within the ISI. In April 2009, reports emerged that the Iraqi military had finally captured Abu Omar al Baghdadi. The Interior Ministry held a press conference displaying a man who they claimed was the elusive emir. Photographs were released, and government officials confidently declared a major victory in the fight against terrorism. However, just days later, the Islamic State of Iraq issued a statement denying that Abu Omar had been captured. According to the site intelligence group, the denial was followed by an audio recording, purportedly from Abu Omar himself, in which he mocked the Iraqi government's claim and reaffirmed his leadership. This was not the first time that Abu Omar had been prematurely declared dead or captured, and it would not be the last. The cycle of rumor and denial had become routine, feeding the mythos of a leader who appeared invulnerable, always one step ahead of his enemies, always re-emerging to taunt them after each failed attempt. Still, intelligence analysts were skeptical. Some believed that the recordings could have been pre-recorded or issued by a deputy using the name of the emir. The confusion surrounding his identity persisted, and even within jihadist circles, whispers circulated about whether Abu Omar was still alive or had already been replaced. The resilience of ISI's media machine added to the uncertainty. While many insurgent groups faltered under pressure, IC maintained a steady rhythm of publications, martyrdom videos, communiques, theological tracts, and recruitment messages. Abu Omar remained the movement's chief ideologue, delivering sermons that condemned the U.S. occupation, vilified the Shia-led government, and called on Muslims to resist apostasy and secularism. He spoke of a long war of attrition, of faith, and of patience. To his followers, his continued voice was a symbol of divine favor. To his enemies, it was a haunting reminder of unfinished business. But behind the scenes, IC was under strain. Repeated losses of mid-level commanders had degraded its ability to coordinate attacks, and the loyalty of tribal networks was no longer guaranteed. Moreover, funding from foreign donors had diminished, forcing the group to rely increasingly on extortion, smuggling, and criminal enterprises to sustain itself. Abu Omar understood that the future of the movement depended on surviving long enough to rebuild. He and Abu Ayyub reportedly moved often, sometimes disguised as merchants or shepherds, using a network of safe houses protected by a shrinking ring of trusted aides. Then, in early 2010, a significant breakthrough occurred. A joint intelligence operation between American and Iraqi forces identified a communication pattern that suggested the presence of senior ISI leaders in the Tikrit area, the birthplace of Saddam Hussein and a known insurgent hotspot. Further surveillance revealed movement to a safe house located approximately 10 kilometers southwest of Tikrit in a small village off the main road. Signals intelligence indicated that the house was receiving encrypted messages believed to be destined for Abu Omar and Abu Ayyub. The operation that followed was swift and secretive. Using information obtained from a recently captured ISI, courier, U.S. and Iraqi special forces launched a raid on the safe house on April 18, 2010. What they found inside would confirm years of pursuit. According to Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, the attack was initiated by ground forces who surrounded the house, followed by missile strikes that struck the compound with devastating precision. Inside, the bodies of Abu Omar al Baghdadi, Abu Ayyub al-Masri, and several of their aides, including Abu Omar's son, were recovered. In addition to the bodies, intelligence officers seized laptops, USB drives, and paper documents, some of which included direct communications between the ISI leadership and al-Qaeda's senior figures, Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. The announcement was made publicly on April 19, 2010, in a dramatic news conference held by Prime Minister al-Maliki. He presented photos of the corpses and stated, "The death of these terrorists is potentially the most significant blow to al-Qaeda in Iraq since the beginning of the insurgency." U.S. General Raymond Odierno echoed the statement, praising the operation as a major step forward in dismantling the ISI's leadership network. The significance of the raid was not merely tactical, it was symbolic. After years of myth, deception, and elusiveness, Abu Omar had finally been unmasked in death. The man once doubted to exist was now confirmed. His identity, long hidden behind audio recordings and pseudonyms, was now a matter of record. But even in death, Abu Omar's story did not end. The ISI, in keeping with its ideological narrative, cast his death as martyrdom, releasing a 4-page statement on jihadist forums honoring him and Abu Ayyub as heroes of the faith. "Two knights have dismounted to join the group of martyrs," the statement read. "The Muslim nation has lost 2 of the leaders of jihad." His Sharia minister, Abu al-Walid Abd al-Wahhab al-Mashadani, later confirmed that both men had been attending a meeting when the compound was bombed. They died together, commander and Emirstol, plotting the resurrection of the Islamic State. For most of the world, the death of Abu Omar al Baghdadi marked the end of a dangerous chapter in Iraq's insurgency. But for the movement he helped build, it was only the end of the beginning. A new figure would soon rise to claim his legacy, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, a man who would turn the dream of a caliphate from rhetoric into horrific reality. Part 7. Aftermath of a Death. The Myth and its Successor. The death of Abu Omar al-Baghdadi in April 2010 was a moment of symbolic triumph for the Iraqi government and the U.S.-led coalition. After years of chasing shadows, of hearing his voice in recordings but never glimpsing his face, the man had finally been eliminated. To the authorities in Baghdad and Washington, this was the killing of not just a man, but of a movement's core. The emir of the Islamic State of Iraq, the shadowy figure many had doubted even existed, was now dead and definitively identified. But insurgent movements, particularly those rooted in ideology and myth, are not easily destroyed by the removal of a single leader. If anything, Abu Omar's death only magnified his image among jihadist circles. He was no longer merely a Mahdi, was now a martyr, a lion of Tawhid, as he was called in ISI eulogies. His death, like his life, became a tool for propaganda, used to stoke further resentment, inspire loyalty, and galvanize future recruits. The finality of his end became an entry into legend. Within jihadist messaging forums, Abu Omar's death was framed not as a defeat, but as a divine test. Islamic history was rich with precedents of leaders falling in battle only for their followers to emerge stronger. From the Prophet Muhammad's companions who perished at Uhud to later Islamic reformers who died resisting colonial powers, martyrdom was not the end, it was transformation. The ISI's four-page statement eulogizing him and Abu Ayyub al-Masri was steeped in religious symbolism, referring to them as two lions who fought with steadfastness, whose blood would nourish the soil of jihad. This rhetorical alchemy turning loss into inspiration was one of the key strengths of jihadist movements like ISI. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the swift, almost immediate succession planning that followed Abu Omar's death. Just weeks after his killing, the Islamic State of Iraq announced a new emir, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Little was known about this successor at the time. Like Abu Omar, he used a kunya that linked him to Baghdad, grounding his authority in local identity while preserving secrecy. Unlike Abu Omar, however, Abu Bakr's religious credentials were more prominent. A former scholar of Islamic jurisprudence with a PhD in Islamic studies, Abu Bakr represented not just military and ideological continuity, but religious legitimacy. His rise marked the start of a more structured and formalized leadership model within the ISI. The transition was seamless and orchestrated to signal strength rather than instability. ISI's media wing immediately began issuing new recordings, now in the voice of Abu Bakr, echoing many of the theological themes laid out by his predecessor. He praised Abu Omar as a true mujahid and declared that the path of jihad would not be derailed by martyrdom. If anything, he claimed, Abu Omar's blood had watered the tree of the caliphate, which would soon bloom anew. Indeed, Abu Omar's ideological influence lived on through Abu Bakr and the evolving ISI leadership. The framework of governance that Abu Omar had envisioned, a proto-state with governors, courts, and administrative structures, remained in place. While it had been battered by the awakening movements and U.S. operations, its skeleton endured, ready to be rebuilt when conditions were ripe. Abu Omar's harsh policies toward Shia Muslims, his denouncement of democracy, and his theological justification for mass violence all became doctrinal pillars of what would eventually become the Islamic State, IS. His vision of an Islamic emirate was not abandoned, it was merely postponed, waiting for new opportunities to arise. These opportunities would come a few years later, amid the Syrian civil war and the eventual U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. But beyond strategy and structure, what Abu Omar left behind was a narrative of divine inevitability. He had planted the seeds of a transnational Islamic revolution rooted in Salafi jihadist ideology. For many young radicals, especially those following the movement online or from outside Iraq, Abu Omar's story was irresistible. A former police officer who rejected secularism, turned to piety, took up arms, survived assassination attempts, and died fighting the crusaders and apostates. Even the ambiguity of his life, the rumors, the alleged fabrications, the conflicting reports only added to his allure. He was not just a man, he was an idea, and ideas are notoriously difficult to kill. Within intelligence and academic circles, debates about Abu Omar's legacy intensified. Was his death the high-water mark of ISI's influence? Or was it the spark that would ignite a broader, more dangerous jihadist movement? Historians of terrorism and Middle Eastern affairs would later look back on his tenure as a critical moment in the evolution of global jihad, an early model for what a jihadist state might look like, with its rigid ideology, territorial ambitions, and hierarchical structure. Meanwhile, on the ground in Iraq, remnants of ISI continued their low-level insurgency, engaging in bombings, assassinations, and raids often in the same provinces where Abu Omar had once governed in the shadows. Though the ISI had been decapitated, it was not defeated. The cycle of recruitment, indoctrination, and regeneration that Abu Omar had built continued to function. His body may have been buried in an unmarked grave, but his ideology had found new life. And in the years that followed, the world would come to learn that Abu Omar al Baghdadi was not merely a phase in Iraq's insurgency. He was a precursor, a warning of what was yet to come. Part 8. Legacy in the Shadows. Ideological Foundations of the Caliphate. The legacy of Abu Omar al Baghdadi did not vanish with the detonation of a missile or the crumbling of a safe house wall near Tikrit. On the contrary, his death elevated him into a potent symbolon that would deeply influence the direction, strategy, and self-conception of the jihadist movement he helped build. Though most of the world's attention would eventually shift to his successor, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, it was Abu Omar who laid down the fundamental ideological architecture upon which the future so-called Islamic State, ISIS, would rise. At the heart of Abu Omar's ideology was a commitment to absolutist theocracy, belief that all human governance was invalid unless explicitly based on the Quran and Sunnah, as interpreted through a strict Salafi lens. This core principle permeated every decision made under his leadership. Unlike earlier insurgents who couched their goals in terms of political liberation, nationalism, or anti-imperialism, Abu Omar sought to construct a new order entirely, one in which divine law reigned supreme, and secularism, whether Western, Ba'athist, or democratic, was treated as apostasy. This doctrinal rigidity was not incidental. Abu Omar drew heavily on the writings of classical scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah and more modern jihadist thinkers like Sayyid Qutb and Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. His worldview was apocalyptic, dualistic, and uncompromising. There was truth and falsehood, Islam and Jahiliyyah, pre-Islamic ignorance, Tawheed and Shirk, monotheism versus idolatry. His speeches frequently cited historical examples from early Islamic history to justify the ISI's actions, from the establishment of the first Islamic State in Medina to the brutal conquests that followed. In practical terms, this meant Abu Omar saw no difference between political opponents and religious enemies. Whether Shia Muslims, Sunni rivals who rejected ISI's supremacy, Christians, or secular Arab nationalist any group not swearing loyalty to the Islamic State and abiding by its laws was considered a legitimate target. This ideological foundation provided theological justification for mass executions, suicide bombings in civilian areas, and the establishment of Sharia courts that issued death sentences with medieval swiftness. His disdain for traditional forms of Islamic political activism was also clear. Abu Omar had no use for Muslim Brotherhood-style movements that sought incremental change through political participation. To him, these were betrayals of divine mandate, attempts to blend divine law with man-made institutions. The Islamic State of Iraq, as he envisioned it, was the sole legitimate authority, and the Bay'ah oath of allegiance to its emir himself was binding upon all Muslims in the territory it claimed. Another critical aspect of his legacy was the doctrine of takfir, or the excommunication of fellow Muslims. While takfir was not new to jihadist ideology, Abu Omar wielded it with extreme breadth. He issued statements declaring entire groups as apostates, including large segments of the Iraqi Sunni population who refused to fall under ISI's authority. This sweeping use of takfir justified purges, executions, and the repression of tribal leaders who might otherwise have served as allies. It also sowed the seeds of division and rebellion, eventually leading to the backlash of the Sunni Awakening movement, which nearly crippled ISI in its early years. But Abu Omar's vision was long-term. He knew that revolutions were not built overnight. Even as the ISI's territorial control was rolled back and its commanders killed or captured, He maintained the belief that perseverance and ideological purity would eventually prevail. His speeches often reminded followers that the Prophet Muhammad faced setbacks, defeats, and betrayals before establishing the first Islamic State. These narratives were not merely theological, they were strategic tools, fostering patience and long-term commitment among his cadre of believers. Importantly, Abu Omar also established a governing model that future iterations of the Islamic State would expand upon. Under his leadership, the ISI began implementing basic structures of Islamic governance in areas it controlled, however briefly. It established Sharia courts, appointed provincial governors, and issued decrees on taxation, marriage, and punishment. This rudimentary state apparatus, primitive and often brutal, was nonetheless the blueprint for ISIS's later bureaucratic model, which would shock the world with its level of sophistication in 2014-2015. Abu Omar's influence also extended into the realm of media and messaging. The ISI's media wing, Al-Furqan Foundation, was developed under his rule into a powerful propaganda tool that fused religious instruction with revolutionary messaging. It produced videos, audio lectures, digital magazines, and battlefield footage, all curated to project strength, legitimacy, and divine purpose. Abu Omar's speeches, in particular, set a precedent for the future caliphal declarations of ISIS. His rhetorical style, quiet, composed, and imbued with religious authority, became a template for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's later sermons. In retrospect, one can see that Abu Omar was not merely a terrorist leader, nor simply a wartime ideologue. He was a founder, an architect of a vision that would outlive him. His name, for a time, faded from the headlines after his death, overshadowed by the theatrical and catastrophic rise of ISIS under Abu Bakr. But within the internal literature of jihadist movements, he was remembered as a pioneer, the first to declare an Islamic State on Iraqi soil, the first to demand bay'ah as a ruler, and the first to transform a loose insurgency into a proto-state governed by a claim to divine law. For historians, policymakers, and counterterrorism experts, understanding Abu Omar al-Baghdadi's legacy means recognizing how ideas can precede and outlive the men who articulate them. His influence was not felt solely through bullets or bombs, but through his insistence that the fight was not just against foreign armies, but against an entire global order. His doctrines seeded the future, giving birth to a movement that would eventually stretch from the deserts of Syria to the streets of Paris. Abu Omar had crafted more than an insurgency, had crafted a narrative of divine inevitability. Part 9. Conclusion: Abu Omar al-Baghdadi and the roots of the caliphate. Abu Omar al-Baghdadi's life ended in a sudden burst of fire and smoke, but the consequences of his legacy would reverberate long after his death. For years, he remained a shadowy figure, often doubted, always feared, operating in the margins of war-torn Iraq. To his enemies, he was a terrorist, a phantom, a menace that had to be eradicated. To his followers, he was an emir, a scholar-warrior, a symbol of steadfastness against the infidel invader and the corrupt apostate. But beyond both perceptions lies a more nuanced and chilling reality. Abu Omar was a foundational architect of the modern jihadist state. His journey from tribal youth in al-Zawi to police officer, from mosque preacher to insurgent, and finally to self-declared emir of the Islamic State of Iraq traces a broader arc of political collapse, radicalization, and ideological militancy that defined the post-2003 Middle East. Unlike some jihadist leaders who emerged from the world of clandestine warfare or battlefield charisma, Abu Omar fused administrative discipline with theological absolutism. He envisioned not just a resistance, but a state, and in many ways, he built one. Though the Islamic State of Iraq under his leadership was territorially limited, his efforts laid the doctrinal and organizational foundation for its later transformation into the Islamic State, ISIS. The idea that a caliphate could be declared unilaterally, that obedience to its leader was a religious obligation, that apostasy could be widely applied, and that Sharia could be enforced immediately through violence. All of these beliefs were normalized and codified under Abu Omar. What many in the global community viewed as a sudden and unprecedented emergence in 2014 had, in truth, been a decade in the making, nurtured in the ideological trenches dug by Abu Omar. His use of takfir, not merely as a theological position but as a weapon of governance and purging, would become a hallmark of ISIS's brutality. His rejection of tribal compromise and democratic inclusion isolated him in the short term but created a more militant, purified core of followers, individuals who would later run the ISIS caliphate with ruthless efficiency. His use of media and religious rhetoric to elevate his authority above the battlefield also ensured that even in death, his voice continued to shape the narrative of jihad. Importantly, Abu Omar's career also reveals a grim lesson about the adaptability of violent ideologies. He was not born into militancy. He was educated, state-employed, and integrated into Iraq's social fabric before becoming radicalized. His path to extremism was marked not by irrationality but by a calculated and evolving worldview, one shaped by disenfranchisement, religious conviction, repression, war, and opportunity. He was a product of Iraq's unraveling, a man who stepped into the chaos and offered a grim vision of divine order to those seeking purpose in a collapsing world. The state, he declared in 2006, mocked by some, denied by others, was never fully realized under his leadership. But the idea of it endured. Less than 4 years after his death, his successor, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, stood atop the pulpit of the Grand Mosque of al-Nuri in Mosul and declared the rebirth of the caliphate. It was a moment that stunned the world. But for those who had followed Abu Omar's trajectory, it was not surprising. The vision had always been there. Abu Bakr was simply the inheritor of a blueprint already drawn in blood and fire. In the end, Abu Omar's most enduring legacy was not the number of attacks he ordered or the provinces he claimed, but the model of governance he introduced to jihadism. He reimagined the role of a jihadist leader not merely as a military commander or spiritual guide, but as a ruler, a caliph in waiting, with the right to demand allegiance and punish rebellion. He formalized the dream of a Salafi theocracy enforced by force of arms and piety of rule. His death in 2010 was, to the world, a tactical victory. But to the Islamic State's inner circle, it was the canonization of a martyr, the birth of a sacred legacy. It hardened their resolve and deepened their belief that their mission was divinely ordained. Every future battle, every beheading video, every speech invoking the caliphate bore traces of his voice, stern, unwavering, rooted in divine justice. Today, Abu Omar al Baghdadi remains a cautionary figure and example of how political collapse, ideological rigidity, and unchecked violence can coalesce into something far more dangerous than any single man. He lived and died in the shadows, but the ideas he unleashed cast a long, dark one over the 20th century.